and then we'll get going. And I'm not saying I disagree with him. Ben, I'll let you kind of touch on this as well, obviously. But my thoughts overall is that Notre Dame beat themselves in that game. I think we talked about this after that game ended and in the weeks after. I do think Cincinnati dominated to a certain extent. But I think when you really turn on that tape, you saw a Notre Dame program that was not playing to their caliber that they've been playing over the last few weeks. They weren't playing the up-tempo offense that they've shown that they're pretty good at. Buckner wasn't really involved in the offensive scheme at that point either, which I think is a big deal. And obviously, certainly if Kyle Hamilton is healthy, which he was healthy for that game, and due credit to Cincinnati, and actually got beat for a touchdown on that game in that game as well. But overall, I just think Notre Dame is a better football team right now than they were when they played Cincinnati. And I know Chip is kind of mentioning some other things here and there. The biggest thing is I think it was 3-0 on turnover ratio in that game. And to me, that's beating yourselves when you're a program like Notre Dame that does not turn the football over almost ever. At this point, they're one of the better teams in the country over the last several seasons in not turning the football over. You had a kickoff return that was fumbled. That is very rare. Notre Dame very rarely even takes the ball out of the end zone on kickoff returns. And then I forget what the other two.
Jack Cohn had that terrible interception on the first drive of the game where
when they were driving down to go up 7-0, and Jack Cohn just throws the ball right to a defender in the red zone. And you certainly give Cincinnati credit in those situations. I mean, that's where I think this is getting confused, and me saying that Notre Dame beat themselves. I'm not saying that Cincinnati wasn't the better football team that day. I'm saying that it was coupled by the fact that Notre Dame allowed them to be the better football team in that game to a certain extent. And right now, I think Notre Dame is a much better football team than they were 4 or 5 weeks ago when they played Cincinnati.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the direction and what's different about the two teams, I mean, I don't follow Cincinnati football enough to be able to talk about their personnel and that type of stuff, but Cincinnati's not looked good. Notre Dame's looked much better. Notre Dame is playing starting two different offensive linemen now than they were when they played Cincinnati. The offensive line play has improved overall. I mean, I think it was at its peak worst when they were playing Cincinnati, to be honest with you. Jack Cohn took 1 million sacks the first however many weeks of the season. And then, of course, in the first drive of the game against Cincinnati, he decides, well, this is the time where I'm going to try to throw out of it, and threw it right to Cincinnati. I mean, I believe Jonathan Dorr missed a field goal in that game, muffed the kickoff return, like you said. I mean, you're right. I mean, Cincinnati, obviously, yeah. And then obviously Cincinnati, forced, I mean, they blitzed, they forced Jack Cohn into that bad decision. But I mean, if you watch the rest of the tape for the rest of the season, Jack Cohn hasn't made that bad panic throw all year, and then all of a sudden he does against Cincinnati.
Yeah, usually just takes a sack.
Right. And so, and like you said, Buckner was not really a weapon in that particular game. Really wasn't involved all that much. Is now maybe at that point, when Notre Dame was scuffling so bad, maybe they go to Buckner. And if that game's played again, I just tweeted a little bit ago that I would love Notre Dame and Cincinnati to, meet up outside the college football or in the college football playoff. I don't care, but I'd love for them to meet up in January or late December or whatever it is again. Because I do think that overall Notre Dame's the better football team. Cincinnati was benefited from Notre Dame was, I don't know, hadn't figured everything out yet. And I think Cincinnati was more experienced, I guess you could kind of say, in a lot of areas in that game. And honestly, I think if they play 10 times, Notre Dame wins 6 or 7 of them at the very least. So I don't know. I think it's not exactly correct to just say that, Cincinnati wasn't the better football team on that. I mean, that's true. They were the better football team on that day. Notre Dame played terrible, and Cincinnati certainly had a lot to do with that. But I just don't think that most of that stuff happens on a normal Notre Dame home game, especially.
Yeah, I think that's where people get confused sometimes. A team can be the better football team during that game, and the other team can also beat themselves, because beating yourselves makes you not the better football team.
Absolutely.
And again, that's not meant to be an insult. I mean, sometimes being the better football team makes the other team force those mistakes. So in that specific game, yes, I do agree with Chip to an extent here that, yeah, I mean, clearly Cincinnati did dominate Notre Dame in certain aspects of that game, but I also think that those are mistakes that can be avoided at this point for Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
And if they were to play again, knowing what they know now, I think those mistakes would be avoided overall. So
Cincinnati took advantage. I'll just sum it up by this: took advantage of Notre Dame weaknesses that are not as much of a weakness at the very least right now. The offensive line, especially. I mean, Notre Dame's offensive line still isn't great, but they're playing far and away better than they played. Whenever that game was there in October.